Hello, this is Gio, and today I am talking about how to strip wire. There are many different types of wire, there are many different types of strippers. Quite often you see these kind of strippers. These are just called wire strippers, and they have many different size wires you can strip. One of the things you have to be aware of is wires typically comes in what is known as gauge, and gauge, it's a little counterintuitive. The larger the wire in terms of thickness, the smaller the gauge. So when you look at a relatively thick wire, like this particular wire, this is actually a smaller gauge compared to this wire, which is a thinner wire. This is a larger gauge. So it's something you just have to be aware of when purchasing wire. It's kind of reversed. And there's different types of wires. There's these type of wires that are bundled, like multiple wires in one bundle of insulation, and these are typically found in your house walls and are connected to your light fixtures, your switches, and your outlet receptacles. You also then have these typically just independent wire, which can be found in a lot of electronics. These you typically do not find in your house walls. And then you also get these little bundled wire. It's also bundled, similar to this, but these are typically found in your home, perhaps like in this case a plug to a light switch or to a toaster even, and these just a different type of wire. And the ones that come in bundles, typically you see 3 wires in these type of bundles. In your house wiring, commonly you have 3 identified types of wire, one in white insulation, one in black, and one without insulation, and this would be the ground wire, and these would be in and out current, and this would be in case you have a short. The short goes to the ground wire to your ground, and your fixture or your plug wire. Similarly, you have a white, you have a black, and in this case you have an insulated green wire. When you see green, that's typically a ground wire. It's just not. In this case, it doesn't need insulation, but quite commonly in these type of plugs or in your household electronics, it does have some kind of insulation, and typically green for ground. So to start stripping, all you really need in this case, you probably need a couple things. Besides some kind of common stripper, you need some kind of snip. You could either have just a plain snip or a snip with a kind of a grabber plier type attachment, but a snip just so you could snip the wire. So you're usually starting with a snipped wire without all you see is insulation, and if you look at the very tip, you can see the wire there, but it's not exposed. And if you use this type of wire stripper, you just start put in the hole. Let's try the 10 gauge wire, and the 10 gauge is much larger than the wire itself, so you want to go down one. Here's 12 gauge, and that's even it's still loose. When you get to the 14 gauge, it's starting to grab, but it still kind of moves in. What you want is to pick a cutting hole that is smaller than your outside insulation. You want to score and cut the insulation. So you want the hole smaller than the outside diameter of your insulation. So let's go down, instead of 14 gauge, go down to 16 gauge. And that in fact is actually cutting into, when you apply pressure, you're cutting into the insulation. And you not only want to cut, but you also want to turn a little bit. And so this is essentially scoring. I don't know if you could see that, but you're actually scored the outside of the insulation. And then after you do that, you just keep it closed, and then you pull the wire out smoothly, and now the wire, the metal wire, is exposed. And hopefully you didn't cut or score the wire itself. Hopefully you selected a large enough hole for your snip so you scored the insulation but didn't actually cut the wire. There's also different types of snips. Let me just cut this real quick. Here's kind of an older type snip. You could also still find these, and it's much more complicated. It basically holds the wire, crimps it, and then pulls it out automatically, so you don't actually have to use that forceful. You don't actually have to force it out yourself. So in this case, we picked the 16 gauge, I believe, is what we did. So that's the cutting hole, and then this kind of grabs it, and as you squeeze it, it just slowly pulls it out. So you don't even have to really apply much pressure, and it will cut nicely. So the last way of doing it, and it takes much more skill, and I don't have the best skill in the world, but is just to use the wire snip itself. And you would do this just by applying a little bit of pressure, not enough to fully cut the wire, but you're just applying a little bit of pressure on the outside of the insulation just to score the insulation, and you're kind of going back and forth, applying a little bit more pressure, kind of feeling your way until you kind of, I don't know if you can see this, but you're scoring the wire. You're trying to get as close to that wire as possible without cutting into the wire, the metal wire itself. And then when you think you've gone far enough, you just apply a little pressure without cutting the wire itself, and then pull it off. And that will take some practice. You'll need to practice with a number of wires. I wouldn't recommend doing this with a wire you need to keep. But if you don't have these handy, or if you haven't purchased one wire snip, you could always use just a regular snip to do the same purpose. And there are also other types, like I said, there's other type of wire. In this case, this is very kind of similar, maybe a little larger diameter, but this type of wire has actually, instead of having one wire in the middle, it has actually many different finer, smaller wire. And quite often you see these with your, let's say, an electrical outlet. This is for a plug for that, an outlet, perhaps a light socket. And so these have many smaller wires, and it does the same thing essentially for this. It's the combination of these smaller wires kind of act as one big wire. But when cutting these type of wires, you do a similar thing. If you have wire snips, you select a hole size which is just a bit smaller. In this case, maybe the 14 gauge wire would work. I think that would work, and then you just sort of just turn it around. Is that working? Yes, it is. You kind of work it through, and then you pull it, and then it comes out, and it comes out as all these little tiny wires. And most of the time, you want to just take your fingers and kind of spiral these or bundle these wires together so you could actually utilize them. It almost acts as one wire then if you kind of thread them together like that. So that's typically what you want to do there. But the last type of wire I want to talk about is these typical house wires, where you have bundles of 3 wire in a much thicker insulation. And when you purchase this or see these type of wires, you typically don't see them just exposed like this. Let me show you the other end. Here is the other end, and it's usually you see the wires at the end, but they're all surrounded in this bundle. So you also need one other piece of one other tool, your cutting blade. And so what you want to do, and quite often when you have 3 wires, the ground wire, the wire without the insulation, you can normally identify it. Quite commonly it's in the center, but not always. In this case, it's actually on the side. And usually when you cut these outer casings, you want to do it on the side where the ground wire is, whether it's in the middle of it or on the end, because if you accidentally hit that particular ground wire, you won't cut into its insulation since it has no insulation. Where the white and black wire, you could accidentally score and cut through the insulation, and that's something you don't want. So if you could spot where the ground wire is here, and in this case it's kind of at the end, you kind of want to cut that end of the outer casing. And you have to do this carefully. You could cut yourself very easily if you slip. And so you want to cut far enough back, and I didn't do that far enough back in this case, so you could strip back and expose enough of the wire. So I've cut this, and I've exposed the insulation, and quite commonly, so I was wrong. See, the actually ground wire was kind of looped there, and the ground wire is in the middle. So hopefully I didn't cut that outer black wire. But in this case, the ground wire itself, although it doesn't have insulation, it does have this paper protection, and you could just rip that off. It's not necessary for this purpose, and you want to cut the excess outer casing to expose your 3 wires. And the ground wire in this case you don't need to strip since it's already stripped. It has no insulation. And the other white and black wire, you could just strip it normally with your stripper. In this case it's a larger gauge wire, so or actually smaller gauge wire since it's in reverse. It's a thicker wire, but a smaller in terms of number. It's a smaller gauge wire. So I'm trying the 12 gauge here, and that's about the right size. So I squeeze, I turn a little bit, and then I pull, and hopefully there we go, a larger or a smaller gauge wire, and perfectly exposed. Now you could just connect it to whatever you need. You could just shape the wire, so if you need to connect it to, let's say, a screw or something, it has the right shape. So those are just a few wires, and it's pretty simple. Just a little bit of practice. Getting the right tools really help, but if you only have snippers, make sure you practice. Thank you very much.